Yo, not here with my quick meta guides on the balanced druid, the boomkin, the unmistakable laser chicken. As always, we've got a little disclaimer. This is a broad overview covering the areas I wanted to know as a consumer before ultimately doing it myself, and these areas are the PvE basics, talents, stats, raid gameplay, that kind of thing. Then I'll move on to cover the strengths and limitations of the spec, or put differently, why you may or may not want to play Boomkin in TBC. And finally, we'll cover professions and PvP briefly, but you may want to seek out in-depth guides if you want every little last bit of detail. So let's start with the talents. Unfortunately, there's not much wiggle room here. It's mostly numerically correct to go to a specific way, but I will note that there's a few flexible points as we go through. So first up, we take 5 out of 5 Starlight Wrath, which is an upgrade on the improved Wrath talent from Vanilla, as it also cuts our Starfire cast, which was taken from later down in the tree from Vanilla. So here it's a no-brainer pick. We want more Slam Dunk passive damage boosts from Focused Starlight and improved Moonfire in row 2, which then leaves us with a point to get to row 3. This can go anywhere, but typically Nature's Grasp is a nice utility point to take, and it now can be used inside your shapeshifted forms, which is great. In row 3, we want to take Insect Swarm and Nature's Reach for quality of life, which again leaves us with 2 points spare to get to row 4. I personally advocate for 2 out of 3 in Control of Nature, as I quite like the PvP outside of raiding, as getting pushback reduction on Cyclone is great. However, Brambles is a nice small DPS increase for the tanks, and as such the raid, so if you're a full PvE boy, Brambles is definitely the way forward. Vengeance is the slam dunk in row 5, it's just insanely good. We then want to literally take all points below row 5, with Moonglow being a variable selection. We have to put 1 point in there to get to row 7, but whether you put the second and third point is not certain. Likewise, Force of Nature is optional. Whilst it's a strong spell and a DPS increase when used correctly, the AI is pretty awful and the HP of these Trents is very low. They die to a small breeze, to quote somebody who asked about Force of Nature. This can lead to situations where you use it and they don't do a lot. We then have between 14 and 17 points spare, which to be honest, don't have fantastic homes elsewhere, but the best option is to grab some mana regen from the Rista tree alongside Improved Mark of the Wild. So we take Improved Mark as mentioned, then we can choose whatever for the next 5 points. I prefer Natural Shapeshifter, again PvP orientated, but many will just slam 5 into Naturalist, which has maybe a little bit more PvE utility. After this though, we're going to pick up Intensity for sustainability in fights, and then put 1 or 4 or 3 points in Subtlety for threat reduction. This is the clear area of discrepancy between builds. If threat is never an issue, you'd take 3 out of 3 Moonglow and Forces of Nature with only 1 point in Subtlety. But if you're pulling aggro, which is potentially a concern, but a lot of private servers were known to have threat all over the place a little bit, you may need to reevaluate. This may depend a lot on what kind of raid team you're in and how high the threat ceiling is, or perhaps the presence of a Shadow Priest, which would reduce the need to take Moonglow points. Ultimately, you can make your own choices here, but I would tentatively suggest that 3 out of 3 Moonglow and Force of Nature are probably the play until you have more information on whether threat is an issue or whether mana is a big deal or not in raids. One final note is that I've seen some online resources suggest skipping Improved Fairy Fire. I don't really want to spoil what's about to come, but never drop these points unless someone else has Improved Fairy Fire and is doing it instead of you. It's pretty much the main reason to bring a Boomkin, and you're probably going to be the only Boomkin, so don't skip that. So that's our talents, pretty straightforward with a couple choices. Let's check out the stats now, and it's pretty interesting here with some dependence on tuning and raid composition, similar to what we've already discussed with the talents. For example, if fights are fast or if you have a Shadow Priest in your group, then the value of MP5 and Spirit plummets because you'll be mostly fine on mana. Likewise, whether you're self-innovating or not will matter for the spirit value as well. However, in most cases you won't have a Shadow Priest in your group and may be asked to innovate someone else, and tuning is yet to be determined, so keep in mind, as we discuss Spirit and MP5 a little bit later in a few moments, that it will vary depending on exactly how your raid plays out and also how the fights play out for you. So our first priority is trying to get hit cap, This is 16% for boomies, and as such a lot of our gear will feature hit to ensure we don't have resists. Fortunately, it's a lot easier than in vanilla since we have Balance of Power, which provides 4% hit baseline. Spell Power is of course our baseline stat to stack, whilst Haste and Crit have an interesting interaction. Boomkin wants to crit enough to regularly get Nature's Grace procs for the 0.5 second cast speed reduction, but Haste is stronger per point by a good margin. In fact, Haste can even outscale Spell Power later on, mana providing, in regards to per point value. As such, we want to prioritize Haste without completely ignoring Crit. Now at this stage we have stats that typically other casters would overlook, but have good value for Boomkin depending on the encounter, rage composition and tuning. MP5 is generally valuable, especially early on as mana will be a concern. However, throughout the expansion, unless tuning is a lot weaker than we assume from the term original tuning that they put out, you'll want to keep an eye on MP5 items as well as spirit items if you have the license to innovate yourself. If two pieces are close, prominent private server druids do suggest leaning towards the spirit item, even if it's got a slightly lower total of equivalency points for the purposes of self-innovating. I'd be tentative to suggest exactly how valuable the two mana regen stats are without raid testing available, but it is definitely something to keep in mind rather than ignoring completely in favour of pure DPS secondaries. As mentioned though, if you have a Shadow Priest in your group, you are likely to be able to ignore MP5 and Spirit for the most part, but I must mention min-max compositions will not put these two specs together. Finally, we have Intellect, and boomies value this not only for having a larger mana pool for longer fights, but also Lunar Guidance, which gives boomies a 25% conversion of total intellect into spell power, which means the floor value of intellect is 0.25 spell power, but actually it's larger in reality thanks to the gains of having a larger mana pool, and also an important change that I like to remind people of. And the reason I like to remind people of this is because I know a lot of people raise an eyebrow about how valuable intellect is for certain specs, but let me remind you real quick of that change. As of 2.4, your mana regen per point of spirit increases as your intellect increases. As such, do pay attention to any large intellect discrepancies on gear because it actually has a sizable impact. You're getting some spell power and you're also improving the impact of spirit on yourself. As a final mention though, please, I want to reiterate that the MP5 spirit stuff is going to be in flux. There is literally no way to know for sure at this stage, but as far as an overview goes, you don't want to completely ignore them. So with that covered, we're now onto the gameplay, and this is a little bit like the Elemental Shaman situation. Mana comfort will largely dictate how you deal optimal damage for a given encounter. Baseline, regardless of encounter and mana concerns, etc., you want to maintain improved Fairy Fire on the target. It's one of the key reasons to utilise a Boomkin in the raid, so we're going to focus on that. Now, generally speaking, without mana concerns, you're likely doing a standard Insect Swarm, Moonfire, followed by 3 Starfires repeat cycle. That is kind of the standard way of doing damage. However, if mana is a concern, you may need to drop Moonfire, and especially early on, there will be a handful of encounters where this may be the case. Likewise, in theory, keyword in theory, it is optimal burst DPS to spam Wrath whilst maintaining Moonfire. The issue here though is that Haste cannot take your GCD below 1 second, but you'll be casting Wraths at 1 second with Nature's Grace alone because of the Starlight Wrath talent. When you add Bloodlust and potentially Drums to the mix, we are losing time waiting for the GCD, essentially. On top of this, Tier 4 has a lot of arcane only spell power gear that is very strong, whilst in Tier 5 there is a key set bonus that improves Starfire damage only by 10% if Insect Swarm or Moonfire is up on the target. As such, in practicality, Wrath is probably not going to be part of your gameplay. Perhaps there'll be some use cases figured out by a full sim tool closer to release, but for now though, assume that Wrath is probably out of the picture mostly. This leads us to the part I think most people want to know, and that is the strengths or reasons to play Boomy. Well, first things first, It's got large raid utility without very much population. Whilst you may not be a chart topper on damage, you provide 2 key buffs that literally every raid leader will seek to have in the raid, typically in Improved Verifier for 3% hit to the raid, as well as Moonkin Aura, which is 5% crit now to your group. Likewise, you're not going to have competition for that spot because the population of Boomkins is exceptionally low usually. Very few people want to play Boomy, at least comparatively to other casters. As such, you're going to be a genuine snowflake and highly in demand. So if you like being the would-be prom queen and don't want to worry about finding a raid spot, Moonkin is genuinely one of the top choices in a roundabout kind of way. Similar to Elemental Shaman, but probably even rarer to be seen. Also, don't forget that Arcane Mages might be handing out special favours for Innovates, so maybe you'll be raiding more than just the bosses. Another small thing is that maintaining 2 dots as well as spamming a spell actually counts as a quote-unquote interesting rotation compared to your peers as far as casters are concerned. So it's an okay place to be from a gameplay perspective if you enjoy being a caster. In terms of a moment of glory, it's a little tricky to say given that performance isn't exceptionally high. However, I would put forward Morrogrim Tidewalker. In this fight, you're going to break into the middle of the pack thanks to some hurricane value and also enable your Arcane Mage to do some filthy things with your Innovate support, and maybe you'll get some filthy things in return, but you know, no leaks. Now we're on to limitations, and it's essentially one major limitation, which is why Boomkin is quite rare. People care about their own damage usually, and Boomkin isn't too hot in this department. You can bully the Shadow Priest after the first tier or so, but other than that, you're competing to try to get towards the lower middle of the pack, but assuming equal performance across specs, you're near the bottom, at least as far as damage dealers are concerned. Herein lies the biggest issue for many. Its DPS on a personal level is relatively low, so people who want to be the big pumper kind of should avoid Boomkin, to be honest. However, I do want to note here that there's not too many reasons to hate Boomkin. Likewise, I didn't have too many reasons to absolutely jump out of your skin in love of Boomkin, but there's not too much to hate either. It really comes down to whether you're happy being near the bottom of the DPS meter for the trade-off of looking cool and never having much worries about a raid spot due to your rarity. The rotation is fine, different mana situations will alter your gameplay, and you have more than enough utility to mix it up when things go wrong in a raid encounter. With that said, we're on to professions, and similar to how we discussed stats, there's some nuances to consider that may come down to how long or short fights are. Naturally, tailoring has several great items for casters, and this is no different for Boomkin. The Spellfire set is very strong for Boomkin, and in terms of raw DPS stats is the very best for tier 4, whilst the Spellstrike set is also the best choice for raw DPS in those slots, provided you have the tailoring only set bonus. Without it, the pants are a little worse than the Kazakh pants. Late game also, the best in slot chest comes from a bind on pickup tailoring pattern also, so there is a benefit come Sunwell Plateau also. But the picture of Spellfire is not quite so simple unless fights are breezing past quite quickly across the board, which, you know, is a possibility if your guild has high performance or if tuning is really bad. However, if you're altering your rotation for mana conservation because you're using higher spell damage items with low intellect and no spirit, where gearing with mana in mind would allow you to have a more optimal rotation, it may be better to stick to alternatives with a little less spell damage and more well-rounded stats that play into the mana game, such as the Windhawk set from Leatherworking. Speaking of Leatherworking, it seems the one true idol is resisting the coup at Blizzard HQ and may still be drumming his way to broad usage for min-maxing. If that's the case, Leatherworking is of course a foregone conclusion. However, regardless of how drums end up, Windhawk is a good reason to go Leatherworking, particularly if mana is a concern in relation to boss fight lengths. Following up these two options, Enchanting and Jewel Crafting bring the usual bonuses. 24 spell power to rings is the best static boost across the board you can get, and can be dropped once you enchant your best rings at each tier if you're into full send min-maxing. Dual crafting gives the slightly better gem of course, as well as a late game neck craft that is best in slot for the final phase of the game. In the late game also, alchemy provides the sorcerer's alchemist stone, which has some good value if fights go long, such as the Kill Jaden encounter, but you can probably adjust your professions at the end of the game for this, if necessary. That about wraps up the major profession options. I do want to mention though, if you're strongly attached to a profession, nothing is truly crazy big if drums do get nerfed significantly by the end of beta. This brings us to PvP, and balance is fairly niche, but exceptionally strong in 2s with a rogue. Now it's not the balance you may immediately think of. It's pretty much a resto spec that's playing aggressively with Moonkin form and Dream State for mana longevity. The main perk is the ease at which you can cast Cyclone under duress from melee characters, thanks to the armor bonus from Moonkin form, and then transition into Solid Burst to help your rogue partner finish off the kill target as their partner sits in a CC chain. As far as 3s go, I've not encountered or seen coverage of a comp that utilizes Restokin or Dream State as it's often referred to, but even if there isn't much reason to go Restokin in 3s over the standard deep resto build, the 2s comp with a rogue is generally one of the S tier compositions for that bracket, so you can specialize and be highly rewarded if you're keen to bring some boomy into the arena. As mentioned though, you may want to seek a more in-depth PvP guide to determine the 5's potential for balance, or perhaps if there is actually a 3's comp for Restokin of note. But as far as I know, that's what I've found, and that about wraps up the video. I hope you found the overview useful, and I look forward to seeing you next time, hopefully in your notifications.